This is They Create Worlds, episode 214, the Neo Geo.
If anybody wants to find me, I'll be in the last place you would look. In a place where people used to be, a land that's called reality, you'll find me there.
A quick note before we start. Alex's book, They Create Worlds, the story of the people and companies that shape the video game industry, Volume 1, is on Humble Bundle again for a mere $20 through July 29th, 2024. Go check it out if you want it. Welcome to They Create Worlds. I'm Jeffrey and I'm joined by my co-host Alex.
Hello.
Before we delve into the glories of the Neo Geo, we must now do everyone's favorite part of podcasting, housekeeping.
Oh God, that sounds frightening and boring.
But it's not. Do you know why, Alex?
Why?
Well, you get to see They Create Worlds live and in person.
That's right. Our devoted listeners may remember that last year at Dragon Con, there was a They Create Worlds presentation on the Seventh Guest and how it spurred the rise of the CD-ROM. And I'm going to be back again for another Dragon Con since I'm always there anyway, so I might as well con them into letting me do a panel. Why not? To do a little thing on the 50th anniversary of Dungeons & Dragons, which of course is this year, and just talk a little bit about the very early adoption of Dungeons & Dragons into computer games, even in the pre-commercial era, and then a little bit about how that spread to commercial games and then spread to non-role-playing games so that just about everything in the world is infested with some kind of RPG mechanics, no matter what the core gameplay loop is.
So you're saying D&D had some sort of influence on video games or something. We certainly haven't talked about that ad nauseum.
I mean, maybe just a little bit, just a tiny bit, yes. And we'll be talking about it again as well, because even though we're not ready to announce what our live stream dates are going to be this year, we will be doing a live stream blowout 3-part extravaganza as we always do. For a little bit of synergy here, we are going to basically be covering the same thing in our 3-part live stream as well, though obviously in a greatly expanded form since they only give us 50 minutes at Dragon Con, which is not exactly in line with the average length of a They Create Worlds episode, last I checked.
These things only last about an hour and a half, with raw recordings in excess of 2 hours. Yeah, just a bit.
Yeah, I talk, I say words, things happen.
Lots of things happen. So yes, if you would like to check out They Create Worlds, it is at Dragon Con, which is from...
It's over Labor Day weekend, which makes it August 29th through September the 2nd. The official schedule isn't out yet. My understanding is there's a good chance we'll be doing it on Sunday again, which is when we did it last year, but none of that is, of course, official yet, and the schedule won't be out till a couple of weeks before the con.
So if you have the opportunity to be in the Atlanta area for Dragon Con, feel free to check us out. Look for They Create World, something about D&D, gaming track. Email us, we'll tell you eventually.
Something like that.
In other happy news, I've done it, Alex. It took months and lots of rendering, but it is all done.
Yes.
The entire podcast is on YouTube now.
Oh my. That sounds frightening. Not that it's all available. That sounds exciting, but, that you had to do all that work, that sounds frightening.
Yes, but it's all available now. You can watch / listen to the entire thing on YouTube if you so feel like it.
Yes, that's right, with a visualizer, because it is still an audio podcast. It will always be an audio podcast outside of our occasional live stream dalliances. But if YouTube is your preferred method of consumption, even with just a visualizer, everything is there now, and we will start making some playlists at some point as well to kind of group like episodes and themed episodes together.
So enough preamble for the kids. Let's get to what they all want, which is some sort of console. But not any console, one that is new, and so new it decided to be called Neo, and not just any kind of console that would shake the planet it would geologically do so. So it's called the Neo Geo.
That's right. We are going to look at SNK's hybrid arcade console architecture, the Neo Geo, which was available in the MVS configuration in arcades and the AES configuration in the home. We're going to focus in on the home system, but you can't talk about the home system without talking a little bit about the coin-op system as well, because they are completely linked together. So, yeah, we haven't really done anything on any of the more minor consoles. You know, we've done a lot on the Ataris and Nintendos and Segas of the world. Less on Sony. I still want more sources before I finally go all crazy and do some kind of 20-part episode on them. But we've really done very little on the minor consoles, the obscure consoles. And we have had a couple of requests over time to do something with the Neo Geo, so I feel like there's enough information that we can do something. I mean, we don't necessarily know as much about the Neo Geo's creation and history as we do the Sega Genesis or the Nintendo Entertainment System, but when I started looking into the sources, I was pleasantly surprised that we at least do have enough information to do a coherent episode with some of the depth that we pride ourselves on here at They Create Worlds.
So we get to go into all the depths of the SNK's Neo Geo. So where in SNK's nightmare of history do we even start? At the beginning?
No, we won't do the entire history of SNK in this episode. We are going to keep this to one episode and don't need to go so crazy. But SNK, which originally was called Shin Nihon Kikaku, and then SNK is obviously an abbreviation of that, and then they officially shortened the name of the company to SNK later on, was one of the many coin-operated game developers, manufacturers in Japan that got their start, like so many did, during the blockbusting game boom in the late 1970s, which we've talked about before, and throughout the 1980s was a steady contributor in the space. They were never necessarily the most innovative of companies in that time period, but they had a steady stream of competently made, well-regarded games, including some particular, by the late 1980s, cult classics, particularly Athena, also Guerrilla War, the Alpha Mission games, etc. Really, the story of the Neo Geo doesn't strictly start with SNK. The story of the Neo Geo really starts with the ongoing quest in the coin-operated game space for a system hardware where you could just, as an operator, buy one company's cabinet. I mean, you still buy from multiple companies, but buy one cabinet from a company, and then you have the perfect system that you can just swap out games into forever and ever and ever. Even though this is going to become a home system, it really starts on the coin-op side. There had been attempts to do this several times. Certainly the first prominent example was Data East with their Deco system, their cassette system, at the beginning of the 1980s. A few other companies had tried it at various times after that, but it had never worked out for one reason or another. With the Deco system, as I said, it was a cassette tape format, slow, serial, fragile. The system did have some popularity and success in Japan, but certainly couldn't replicate that internationally and was very quickly obsolete because of that cassette tape system. Of course, Sega Gremlin famously tried it with their system when David Rosen was becoming very scared at the state of the coin-op space and felt that the rate that arcades were buying brand new cabinets was unsustainable, and tried to introduce a system, and they were laughed out of the room. At that time, nobody in the United States was ready for it. A couple of companies in Britain had tried it, but nobody was really interested in buying British games. Nolan Bushnell had the bright idea to try it with Sente, the company he founded after Atari and Pizza Time Theater, but they never had any good games. The one company that did kind of successfully come up with a system was Nintendo, which had their Versus system in the early 1980s, but they got that system together right as they were abandoning the arcade for all intents and purposes. So while the Versus system continued to get some releases as the decade went on, they were never really trying their hardest to stay current in the coin-op field. So there had been a lot of attempts to do this between 1980 and 1985, but none of them really took off for one reason or another. And the only one that even did take off just a little bit, Nintendo's Versus system, was quickly abandoned by its creator for reasons outside of just its success, because, as we've talked about before, Nintendo, due to the increasing regulation in Japan in the coin-op space, was getting out. That was kind of the state of this. It was still something that theoretically sounded like a great idea, but operators were so burnt out by so many false promises that it looked like it was just one of these elusive things that no one was ever actually going to do successfully. Then, of course, you had the crash in the United States, the crash of the coin-operated games industry, video games in particular, which we've talked about on this show before, and you had the aftermath of that. As we talked about in our Picking Up the Pieces episode on the aftermath of the arcade crash, there came to be a great trade in kits after that industry fell apart, because you had a lot of old cabinets, games like Donkey Kong and Defender and Pac-Man, that had sold in their tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of units, and were now just sitting around gathering dust. Arcades that did not have the financial resources anymore to buy whole new cabinets to replace them. So you got a very vibrant kit industry going, which is all about taking a cabinet and putting a new circuit board inside. So your kit needs to be compatible with the harnesses, with the wiring of the cabinet you're putting it into. It has to be compatible with the monitor and the orientation of the monitor you're putting it into. You can't strictly universally necessarily replace a game with a kit, at least not in the 83-84 period, but you started getting this trade in kits that would be made to be compatible with particular very popular games of yore that are just gathering dust. You're starting to have this move towards the idea of, okay, maybe we won't buy whole cabinets every time. Maybe it turns out that that was a bad idea. In Japan, that even goes a step further when they introduce very standardized cabinets and the JAMA standard for harnesses, which made everything very, very interchangeable and very compatible. Once you had this kind of environment in place where a lot of the games are very interchangeable again, this idea of maybe having a single hardware was perhaps once again viable. The company that really broke through on this, again, not the first, because we talked about several examples already, but the company that really broke through on this was actually the company Capcom. Our story of the Neo Geo really does begin at Capcom for reasons that we will see in just a second. Capcom at this time was very much at the technological forefront of what was going on in hardware design. Not just in the arcade, but also in the home. Now, they didn't necessarily have the most fancy, flashiest coin-op cabinets. They weren't doing a lot of those crazy movement-based games like the Segas of the world were doing. But they were doing a lot of work with ROM memory, with PC boards during this time period. They created the first 1 megabit cartridge, for instance, for the Nintendo Entertainment System, which helped usher in the demise of the Famicom Disk System, which we talked about in our episode on that. Kenzo Tsujimoto, the CEO of the company, according to people that were at Capcom at the time, really saw and understood the threat of the Nintendo Entertainment System to the coin-operated market very early. Even though the technology was more primitive, if players were able to play a bunch of games at home, then they very well may stop coming to game centers, even if the game center can, in theory, offer a superior product. So in the mid-1980s here, after the Famicom boom has really taken hold, Tsujimoto really implored his staff to really focus on providing more in the arcade than you could get at home. Just flashier graphics, better sound, a lot of tie-ins or adaptations of material from movies and other forms of entertainment. He felt that they had to offer, kind of in his words, twice as much as what you could get in the home in order to remain viable. As part of this push, the company developed a new system hardware called the CP system, or CPS. The CPS was not the first so-called system hardware, another concept that we talked about in our Picking Up the Pieces episode and the way coin-op had changed after the crash. But what made the CPS system not unique, but certainly unusual, is that it was made to be easily interchangeable. So it was a two-board system where one board was just the standard hardware. That's where the processor and all the chips and all of the standard pieces of the hardware were. But then the second board was a daughter board that contained the ROM and any other specific special custom hardware for the particular game. It was made to be easily swappable between these daughter boards.
It sounds like you could have sort of like a central core computer that had some level of RAM, some level of CPU, disk access, whatever it needed at a core level, almost like a mini console in a way. Then you had these daughter boards that slid in almost like cartridges that had, okay, here's the ROM, here's my special sound effect chip, here's maybe my special graphics chip I have on here that exceeds whatever it can do. Then, we can have maybe 5 games that use the base motherboard. We want to upgrade. Okay, well, here, swap out your base motherboard to this new one. We'll have 5 gigs of RAM instead of 3.
It wasn't made to swap out the base motherboard. The point is that you would buy the cabinet, and that cabinet would have that base motherboard in it, and it would have, would obviously ship with a game in the cabinet on the daughter board. But then, to replace it in the future when that game came out of vogue, all you had to do was replace the daughter board. You didn't have to buy any of that other stuff again. Yeah, in a way, it was not in cartridge form. It was in bare PCB form. But in a way, it was emulating what was going on with cartridges in the home. And I don't think it's probably a coincidence that Capcom was one of the big publishers on the Famicom and came up with this way of doing things for their arcade system. According to the trades at the time, it was a hard sell, this system, because operators had been burned on systems before. Because you always run this risk that you end up in a cul-de-sac. So it's like, okay, fine, you made this great game, and you shipped me this cabinet that has this great game in it, but how do I know the next game you release for this system is going to be any good? Or the one after that? What if you screwed up where the technology was going, and so it turns out that your system is a cul-de-sac? People were very leery because they'd been burned before by the Decos and Sentais of the world by the system hardware. But Capcom fully committed to it and released a great line of games. They were putting most of their games on this going forward. So classics such as Ghouls and Ghosts, Strider, UN Squadron, Final Fight, and even eventually Street Fighter 2 were all created for this system hardware, and they would offer trade-ins. You could get your next board at a discount, trade in, when you turned in an old game that you didn't want anymore. And so they were able to win over operators in the United States. A gentleman by the name of Bill Cravens was very instrumental in that, who had also been at Nintendo when they did their Versus system, and had also been at Universal when they did their Mr. Do kits. He'd always been a proponent of reusable hardwares, and really did a good job of pushing this. It became a real success, and it woke the industry up to the idea that, okay, maybe this system hardware thing has some potential after all. It just so happens that not long after this, SNK headhunts a Capcom game developer by the name of Takashi Nishiyama. This is where the link comes in. Nishiyama is an absolutely legendary figure in the industry. He started out way back in the day at Irem, where he worked on the game Uniwars S and the classics Moon Patrol and Spartan X, known as Kung Fu in the West. Then Tsujimoto had actually founded Irem before he founded Capcom. Then there was a power struggle. He left, founded Capcom, and then Nishiyama went with him. Well, followed him a little bit later. He didn't come right away. At Capcom, he created the original Street Fighter. Not Street Fighter 2, but the original Street Fighter. It was not long after that that he ended up joining SNK. It was Nishiyama, according to him, who had the initial idea to do some kind of interchangeable system, which was no doubt inspired by what he had seen at Capcom. That can't be a coincidence. What Nishiyama was looking at was, how can we better expand our coin-op offerings into developing parts of the world? East Asia outside of Japan, Southeast Asia, South America. Places where there were less financial resources and also a lot of problems with piracy as well. Because kits and daughter boards, like in the CPS system, these are cheaper things than buying a full arcade cabinet. But you're still talking about something that is fairly expensive. So he's the one, according to him in an interview he gave with 1UP, that had the idea of, what if instead of selling games on daughter boards, which are still a little big and bulky and complex, we sell them on interchangeable cartridges. Now, obviously, a cartridge has a PC board inside of it as well. I mean, we're still talking about the similar technology, but in a more compact, cheaper cartridge format. Create a really, really powerful base unit, and then not only have it accept cartridges as an easy kind of swapping, easier and cheaper swapping method, but even make it so that the hardware can accept multiple cartridges at the same time. A system that you can have 4 cartridges plugged into it at once and switch between the games. So now you have something that is really cheap and efficient for places that don't necessarily have the same financial resources.
Not to mention space efficient.
Exactly. So it was out of all of this suggestion from Nishiyama that SNK began work on their Neo Geo multi-video system hardware, or MVS. SNK wasn't necessarily the most savvy company when it came to developing hardware. We have to remember the Japanese market is very different from the North American market. In North America, you kind of have that 3-tiered system of manufacturer, distributor, and operator. Generally speaking, there are exceptions, but generally speaking, the manufacturer is also the developer of the game. There's always been a little bit of independent contracting that's gone on, but the vast majority of games in that space were created in-house. Japan has a lot more of a muddled system because, of course, the manufacturers are also usually their own distributors. Sometimes they're even the operators. So the infrastructure is a lot different, and there's a lot more specialization. You have a lot more small development houses that may be experts at hardware or experts at programming or this and that create games that are then sold on to the big manufacturers who then release them. And the big manufacturers also do their own development, but there's a lot more of a web of companies involved. A lot of SNK's games actually did not release on SNK hardware. A lot of the hardware they worked with was created by another company, a contract manufacturer called Alpha Denshi Corporation, which had been founded back in 1980 as a producer of audio and telecommunications equipment. They kind of got caught up in that Space Invaders boom when a lot of these small companies that had the expertise in working with electronics turned to this incredibly lucrative new field of video games. So they started developing video games that they would then sell on to bigger companies in the industry to actually release. Probably their most famous game up to this point, up to the point that we're talking about in time, was undoubtedly Champion Baseball, which was released by Sega in 1983. It was a baseball game, but it was one of the biggest coin-operated game hits of 1983 in Japan. Obviously didn't make nearly as big an impact in the United States. They had been working with SNK for a few years now and had developed several games for the company and also hardware that SNK used to create some of its own internal games as well. So to design the architecture for this new MVS system, they actually turned to Alpha Denshi. One of their engineers, a guy by the name of Eiji Fukatsu, led the development of this hardware. I don't know exactly where the leap came from to go from, hey, we're creating this new MVS system that is going to be cheaper and more user-friendly for third world and developing nations as a new system hardware using cartridges. I don't know how we got from there to, oh, and we should release a home version of it too. You know, at some point along the line here, development started probably around 1989 or so. At some point in there, they decided, the head of the company, Eikichi Kawasaki, decided that he wanted them to release a home version as well. Unfortunately, we don't have any insight into this. And there are certainly a few observations we can make about the market. First of all, since they were making a cartridge hardware anyway, that made it relatively easy to translate this into a home system because it already had the idea of you have your motherboard and then you're inserting cartridges in it for your individual games. The second thing is the Japanese console market was in a bit of a state of flux at this point because Nintendo was very, very late with their Super Famicom system. It finally comes out in 1990, but remember, as we've talked about in past episodes on the Famicom boom peaked in 1986. So really, Nintendo should have had a successor system out way before. Remember, it came out in 83. Yeah, we're kind of used to 7-year console generations these days. So from our perspective, the fact that the Famicom's 83 and the Super Famicom finally comes out in 1990 in Japan may not seem that odd, but in the context of the time, and in the context of the economics of the industry, that was very late. The Famicom had already peaked in 86, obviously was still successful after that, but it was starting to be on a bit of a downward trend. A couple other companies had come in to try to challenge them. Sega, of course, had competed with them directly in the Famicom days with the SG-1000 and its successors, but is now coming back with the Genesis getting to market before Nintendo. NEC and Hudson Soft have partnered together to release the PC Engine in 1987, which is having some success. It's not outselling the Famicom, despite what you may incorrectly see on some Western sources, but it's doing well. It probably felt like there was an opportunity here to steal one over on Nintendo because Nintendo has been a little tardy to market. Plus, there's just the fact that by 1990, 89-90, the coin-operated games with their fancy 16-bit processors and very colorful graphics are just so far beyond what the Nintendo Entertainment System can do that it's becoming more and more inconvenient to port the latest arcade games to that system. I mean, you can still create ports, obviously, but I mean, they're so clearly inferior to what's in the arcade. I'm sure there was a sense that some home players probably were a bit frustrated at the big difference between what they could play in the arcade and what they could have at home. I don't know what was going through Kawasaki's mind, but certainly these are some of the circumstances that were in place at the time, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of economics going on there. We did not know anything about this console generation. I was just thinking that the Nintendo is, what, first, second generation system? I know we came up with the concept of the zeroth generation system. We have no precedence here. We don't really understand a stable console transition that doesn't result in a crash.
Exactly. I just have to imagine that they saw that maybe there was an opportunity to steal one over. So for whatever reason, Kawasaki mandated that they also create a home version that would be identical to the coin-operated hardware. That is something that makes the Neo Geo home system, the AES. They're technically both called Neo Geo, whereas the arcade hardware is the multi-video system, or MVS, and the home console is the Advanced Entertainment System, or AES, both under the name of Neo Geo. One thing that really stands apart with the Neo Geo is that the hardwares are truly identical. There are a few things on the MVS system that are different from the AES that mostly has to do with things like coin control and stuff like that. Stuff that you need in an arcade machine that you don't need in a home system. Because of some of that, and because I'm sure they didn't want to promote some kind of weird secondhand black market, the cartridges are incompatible between the two. You can't use an MVS cartridge in a home AES system. Other than that, the hardwares are identical in every way that matters. The processors, the video hardware, the sound hardware, the amount of memory, the hardwares are identical between the home system and the arcade system.
That would probably be commensurate with a equivalent cost.
Oh, it will
Even
be.
if I'm not buying a cabinet and I'm not buying a coin slot thing or any of the controls for that, just the hardware and technology alone probably cost a small fortune.
Oh, yes, we will get there, but no, this is going to be a very, very, very expensive system, which is why it's only going to be a niche piece of hardware. Before we get into the economics of all of that, I would like to take a moment to examine the Neo Geo hardware itself and what exactly is being created for the arcade and the home in this time period. Once again, for this, we are incredibly indebted to the website of Rodrigo Copetti. We've used his work before, linked to him in the show notes before, who has just done the most incredible analyses of console hardware throughout the years. Just really in-depth analyses of various home console systems, but written so that a layman can understand what's going on. A lot of this technical stuff, I fully admit, I'm taking directly from his website, and we will once again link that in the show notes. I am not a technical person, but he most definitely is. So if you want a more in-depth look at this kind of thing than we provide on They Create Worlds, that's definitely the place to go.
I already have the link to throw in the show notes.
Indeed. The first thing to note here is that this is, despite how the Neo Geo people, how SNK are going to market it later, this is a 16-bit system. Just like the Sega Genesis, just like the Super Famicom, though of course, in many other ways, it's going to be more powerful. Runs on a Motorola 68000, as was typical of most hardware that use 16-bit chips outside of the PC family. The 68000 was kind of the most popular of the 16-bit processors. The Sega Genesis also runs on a 68000, but there are two key differences between the two systems. First is that the Neo Geo 68000 runs at 12 megahertz. Sega Genesis only runs at 8 megahertz, so it has a higher clock speed. Second, it uses CMOS gates instead of NMOS gates, like the earlier versions of the 68000, which are far more efficient, particularly when it comes to the consumption of power. CMOS needs a lot less power than NMOS. Even on the processor, even though it's equivalent to some of the competition, just in general terms, being a 16-bit 68000, it's already showing itself to be a little superior. But the superiority really isn't in the processor. The superiority is in all of the rest of the hardware. This system has a lot of memory, like a lot. We're talking about 64 kilobytes of RAM and 84 kilobytes of video RAM, which is a huge amount in 1990 for a home system. Then it also has another 2 kilobytes of memory devoted to the sound as well on top of that. It is just packed to the gills with memory, and this allows the Neo Geo to do something that all of its contemporary systems, well, not just its contemporary systems, but all systems up to this point had not been able to do. That is to have complete control of the screen on a pixel-by-pixel basis instead of having to do static tiled backgrounds. Now, there were a couple of early systems that used a frame buffer method where the entire screen was drawn as a complete picture in memory and then pushed to the display, which meant that you did in those systems have complete control of the entire screen, pixel by pixel. But that was only used on systems that had very primitive graphics and no real backgrounds to speak of. I mean, very low detail background. Because the problem with a frame buffer is, of course, it just takes a lot of memory because you have to store the image data and the color data for every single pixel on your display in memory, and that gets very expensive very quickly. Of course, it's all done that way today, but couldn't really do that with the memory available at the time. The Neo Geo didn't quite have enough memory to return to a complete frame buffer system. What it did do is it did use a line buffer system, which meant that it drew the screen one scan line at a time. It drew the scan line in memory and then pushed it to the display one line at a time. NES games, Genesis games, all of those, they relied on static tiles for their backgrounds. And those tiles were generally standardized at a fixed size, like 8x8 or whatever. That's why if you play one of those games, you'll notice in a scrolling game, like a Sonic or a Mega Man or whatever else, there's a lot of repetition in those backgrounds. Because you're basically stamping tiles across the entire back of the screen, and those are static. I mean, you can sometimes animate elements of them, but they're static backgrounds they can't change. Well, the Neo Geo didn't have to use tiles, static tiles for the background, because it drew the sprites by line through a line buffer system. So you had a lot more flexibility, even though the games are still 2D games. It's not a powerful enough system to do polygonal graphics. You're talking about having the capability to have a lot more interesting things going on the screen because everything is sprites. Technically, tiles are also sprites, but they're static. Everything is repositionable sprites in the system. It does have one fixed layer of graphics, but that fixed layer is just used for static elements, UI elements like life bars, timers, score counters, that kind of thing. And that fixed graphics layer encompasses the entire screen. It's not a tile-based thing. Everything else is done fully in sprites. So that makes it a lot more advanced than the other 2D systems on the market. And that's entirely down to the amount of video memory that they are able to cram into this thing, which, of course, is going to make things much more expensive, as we talked about. Then it also has the latest Yamaha FM synthesizer chip, the YM2610, and there's a separate Z80 processor in there specifically to drive the audio. So it also has very advanced audio. It can do some pretty good voice stuff and whatnot as well. So just a very powerful 2D system. About the most powerful that you can do at the time and still get away with pretending that you can release a version of it in the home. Of course, what that means is all that memory is going to cost a lot of money. Obviously, it comes out in Japan first, but when they first announced the system in the United States, they said it would sell for $600. That turned out to be a lie. It ended up costing $650 in 1990 money.
Do we have to pull out the inflation calculator again?
Let's do it.
The number is terrifying. In 2024, that would be $1,561.94. An increase of over 140%.
Indeed. And of course, inflation is not linear. This only gives us a rough because it depends on actually the price of the components and how those individual components have increased in price over time. So, you can never do a straight line calculation, but it gives you an idea, at least. It gives you a ballpark of what an expensive system this was going to be. But it's not just that the system was expensive. Because yes, you paid $650, you got the system, you got two big arcade-style controllers with an arcade-style joystick and arcade-style buttons, and a bundled game. But to get additional games, because these games also have a lot of ROM memory to be as impressive as they are, the cartridges would cost $200 each to buy additional games.
You're spending another $480 in today's money per game.
Yes, every time you buy a new game, it's like buying, like a PlayStation 4 today. PS4s may even be cheaper than that today. But the point is, you're practically buying a whole nother system every time. And remember, this is a period of time when the Sega Genesis, originally came out for $199 and then dropped to $149, and the Super NES started at $249 and then dropped to $199. You're talking about at a time when the top-of-the-line mainstream consoles are in the $150 to $250 range.
You're coming out with something 3 times the price, roughly.
Exactly. Obviously, it also has a lot more power in most ways, not in all ways, which is also what's kind of funny about it. For instance, it has some sprite scaling capability, but it doesn't have all of the fancy sprite scaling and rotation effects that a Super NES has, like Mode 7. It doesn't have any of that kind of stuff.
All that money and I don't get Mode 7? Really?
Yeah. It's exactly the same as the arcade hardware. Like I said, the only differences are stuff that has nothing to do with the performance of the system and has to do with the specific I.O. and whatnot that's needed for arcade systems as opposed to home systems. So you are truly getting the arcade experience in the home, which not even the Super NES or Sega Genesis can quite pull off with those games. But yes, you're going to pay a pretty penny for it. Because it was going to be such an expensive system, when the staff in Japan were designing the thing, the industrial design of it, they did decide that they needed to make it not look like a toy, like the Famicom or the Super Famicom, but to make it look like a hi-fi stereo component, because that's the kind of range of price we're talking about. So the Mega Drive, they took a similar approach at Sega. So the Neo Geo is all black and made to look like a very expensive piece of hi-fi equipment, because it is a very expensive piece of equipment, just a video game instead of hi-fi. They knew it was going to be a hard sell. I mean, they understood that it wasn't going to sell to kids in the same way as that a Super Famicom or a Sega Mega Drive might.
They're truly having to target adults, and very affluent adults.
They're targeting adults. They're targeting hardcore game fans. I mean, there were people that went out and bought arcade cabinets to have in their home. Not many, but there were a few people that did that, and so they figured that they could market to that group. They also figured that they could market it as a rental system as well, because then the rental company can pay the big price and then make their money back by renting it out. When they first launched it in Japan in mid-1990, they actually launched it as a rental system first. Some people have said that it was always meant to be just a rental system, and that it was only after they realized that they had some demand for it that they expanded to selling the system too, and that's not true. We don't have that many interviews from people with inside SNK at this time, but the interviews that we do have indicate that they deliberately went to the rental market first to kind of ease into the idea of this very expensive system and give people a taste of it and give them an idea of what they would be getting for their 50,000 yen, which is about what it cost in Japan. But it was never meant to be a rental-only system. That was always just the first step of a wider introduction to the system. But that is how they started it, just as a rental. Because, yeah, this is a lot. The main thrust was still, I think, the coin-op, because SNK was a coin-op company. The MVS system was a really great thing for coin-op. They released it in two configurations, a 4-cartridge and a 2-cartridge configuration, and they also partnered with the company Romstar, which through corporate shenanigans kind of had some ties with them, which created a 1-cartridge kind of conversion version that you could use as a kit kind of to replace the hardware in other systems. You know, this is a system where you can have multiple games in one unit, greatly reducing the footprint of your system. And the cartridges are about $400 each. This is the arcade we're talking about. As I said, they were $200 in the home. In the arcade, they were about $400, which was half the price of a kit. That was a pretty good deal over kind of standard kit hardware. SNK made a promise that they were going to really support this thing with lots and lots of games. And they just about killed themselves to do that, according to employees that were there at the time. They basically divided their development team into two parts: a group of developers and a group of testers and debuggers. They just literally ran game development for a while they were doing the initial stuff. They just ran development 24/7, or maybe 24/5, but it wouldn't surprise me if it was even 24/7. Because basically they would have the guys do all of the game development and programming and whatnot during the day, and then they handed everything over to the debugging and testing team, who would then spend all night testing everything, and then they'd come back with their feedback, and then the development teams would work in the day, and they just had this perpetual cycle going because it was the only way to get enough games together, because just like Capcom had to do with the CPS hardware that they put out, if you're going to put out a system hardware, you need to, especially at the beginning, provide some pretty big assurance that you're going to have a lot of games for the system hardware, because they're counting on you. They're like, okay, we will buy your cabinet, but your cabinet is useless for anyone else's games. It's only going to be good for your games. So you better have some follow-ups for me to make this investment in your product.
You have to launch pretty much with a very good initial launch library.
Exactly, or at least a very diverse library. That's what Neo Geo did. When they launched in Japan, it launched with 5 games that covered a wide variety of genres. They had a racing game, Riding Hero, motorcycle racing game. They had a baseball game, Baseball Stars Professional. They had a very successful baseball game on the Famicom, Baseball Stars. So they created a more arcadey version of that for the Neo Geo system, Baseball Stars Professional. They had an action platform game, Magician Lord, where you're playing this magician that's using magic to kill all the enemies and progress, and, has to do platforming and stuff like in a Ghosts and Goblins. A shooting game called NAM 1975, which was kind of like Cabal, where it's kind of a target shooting game. You have an aiming cursor that you're moving around the screen and shooting at targets, but your character is also on the screen in the foreground, and your character also has to dodge around to not get hit. They had a shooting game like that in NAM 1975, and then they had a Mahjong game, because in this time period, Mahjong was incredibly popular in Japanese arcades. They're hitting some of the major genres at the end of the 1980s, beginning of the 1990s. Then when they launched in the United States in October of 1990, they didn't launch with the Mahjong game because you didn't do Mahjong games in American arcades, but they had those other 4 games, and then instead of the Mahjong game, they had a game called Top Players Golf. So they had a golf game, which were much more popular in the United States. I don't know that any of these games were necessarily considered the pinnacles of their genres, but they're covering the genres very well that were popular at the time. They followed up very quickly with some other games before the end of the year as well, including one called Ninja Combat that was a beat-em-up kind of game, another genre that was incredibly popular at the time. They were offering a wide range of product right from the beginning, with promises of more to come. The home system launched at about the same time as the arcade system. It came a few months later, but it still came out before the end of 1990, October 1990 in the US. The exact same games basically were available. NAM 1975 shipped with the system, and then all of those other games were sold separately. Now, after that initial group of games, they did institute a 6-month lag between releasing a game for the arcade hardware, coin-op hardware, and releasing it for the home hardware. Since the games are the exact same quality, they didn't want to be losing sales out in the coin-op world because they had released the console game at the exact same time.
It would almost behoove an arcade operator to go, let's just have the home console version over here that I watch you like a hawk and say, all right, give me $10, you can play for 1 hour, and then I kick you off. And then it's a lot cheaper for me versus, okay, here's this Neo Geo arcade cabinet, keep putting in your quarters in, kid, and this cost me a lot more up front.
Yes, and obviously with the success of the Famicom and the upcoming success of the Genesis and the Super Famicom, it was about to get very contentious, this idea that games were being ported to home systems too fast before arcade operators could make back their money. They did, after the initial games, they initiated a 6-month delay. The exact same games that came out on the coin-op system came out in the home. They were virtually identical. But, of course, as we said, for a rather ridiculous price. In the United States, SNK already had an American branch that was responsible for their arcade games. But they didn't want that branch to be distracted by this whole home game thing. So they actually established a new American subsidiary called SNK Home Entertainment in Torrance, California, in order to market the Neo Geo AES, led by a guy by the name of Marty Kitazawa. This was a fairly small branch. It only had a very small staff. They were faced with the same problem that, of course, the Japanese had, which is how the heck do we market and sell something that is this ridiculously expensive? Well, Japan wanted them to focus on the rental market, just like they were doing in Japan. I mean, we have this from people that were at SNK Home Entertainment at the time. Japan was really heavily pushing them to do the video rental thing. They tried, they did a little bit of that, but the problem was it was so expensive that even rental stores couldn't afford to buy it because they would never get enough rentals in order to make back their initial investment.
Heaven forbid if they just walk off with it.
Right.
Or even if you go the innocent route of, okay, they don't walk off with it, but they damage it.
Exactly. They did try the rental route, just like they were doing in Japan, but it wasn't very good. They did talk to some of the regular retailers of video games, the Macy's and the Toys R Us's of the world. Some of those companies took a few systems from them, but it was just too expensive. The mass market retailers in general did not want it, or only wanted it in very, very, very limited quantities. They figured they were mostly going to have to sell to adults. They were definitely targeting an older crowd, like 25 and up, again, according to people that were there at the time. They were kind of pushing really specialty high-end electronic stores, catalogs like the Sky Mall catalog that cater to people that have more money than they know what to do with. Really kind of a specialty product. Their plan was to retail it like a high-end specialty product, but market it like the best of video game products that everyone should want and everyone should need. They went mass market in their advertising, but went kind of specialty high-end in their retailing. They didn't have the resources of a Nintendo or even of a Sega. They did some television advertising, but they couldn't do much. There is a commercial floating around online from 1990. It was very in your face, as a lot of the advertising was then, with the Neo Geo targeting and blowing up Nintendo Entertainment Systems and Sega Genesises because it's this superior system. They really concentrated on the game magazines. They did a huge 16-page insert that was mailed out with Electronic Gaming Monthly. They did a lot of magazine ads using the catchphrase, bigger, badder, better. They hired a local game player by the name of Chad Okawa to be a game counselor. He gave himself the name The Game Lord, kind of named after the Magician Lord game, in order to have this kind of big grandiosity about him. They really marketed hard to the core gamer demographic in the gaming magazines and that kind of thing.
It certainly looks like they put out quite a few Japanese commercials, too.
Well, yeah, and it was marketed heavily in Japan as well, of course. But it was just incredibly expensive. It probably would have vanished without a trace, except that at this exact moment, the fighting game boom happened. Street Fighter II came out. The bubble economy in Japan collapsed. These two things together, I think, gave it what life it did have in the end. First of all, the bubble economy. Of course, the Japanese economy had been incredibly overheated in the late 1980s, rampant real estate speculation, just constant extensions of credits, and all of this had caused the economy to form a bubble that then popped and then really trashed the Japanese economy really badly in 1990-1991. This caused a huge reduction in spending, despite every attempt by the Japanese government to stimulate spending on commodities, and it caused a lot of people to lose their jobs and that kind of thing. But coin-op, historically, I mean, this was true in the Great Depression as well in the United States, coin-op historically does very well in periods of economic trouble because it's a relatively cheap form of entertainment. Despite the bubble economy falling off a cliff at the beginning of the 1990s, this actually corresponded to a sustained period of financial success in the game centers in the coin-operated video game industry in Japan, because you had people that were unemployed with a lot of free time on their hands, and the arcade was there, the game center, as they call them there, was a relatively cheap form of entertainment, so they were going to the game center to spend their time. You got a huge demand for video games, for arcade games, at the exact moment SNK is launching this new system's hardware in Neo Geo. Then, during this whole time period as well, Street Fighter II takes off and starts the whole fighting game boom. So then fighting games just really take off, and it just so happens, and it is coincidence, that SNK was working on a new fighting game at the exact same time that Capcom was working in Street Fighter II. So that game came out only a couple of months after Street Fighter II, and that game, of course, was Fatal Fury. A lot of people assume that Fatal Fury was a Street Fighter II copy or clone because so many of the fighting games that came out in the immediate aftermath of Street Fighter II were just copying what Capcom had done. But in this case, even though they were released so close together, this was actually not influenced in any way by Street Fighter II, and in fact, The creator of the game was none other than the aforementioned Takashi Nishiyama, who had created the original Street Fighter at Capcom. He had been working on Fatal Fury as kind of his sort of unofficial sequel to Street Fighter. Because one thing that he felt that he hadn't done very effectively in Street Fighter, in the original, is that he hadn't created very compelling characters or a very compelling story. The Street Fighter games get ridiculously plot-heavy, starting with Street Fighter 2, but the original Street Fighter didn't have very much going on in that way. Fatal Fury was created to have a real focus on characters and the stories of the characters, above all else. He actually went in a very different direction, which helped separate SNK fighting games out from Capcom fighting games, and they had a real rivalry between each other, which of course let them eventually do the SNK versus Capcom fighting game series. Street Fighter 2 became very much about combos. We talked about this, I think, in one of our episodes about how that kind of came about accidentally, but it was all about chaining together moves to keep your opponent stun-locked, which is also the route that Mortal Kombat took. Whereas Fatal Fury was really more about the special moves. Now, obviously, Street Fighter 2 had special moves as well, and using those special moves was important. But unlike Street Fighter, it wasn't about chaining together moves. It was about using your special moves strategically at the most opportune moment, and not so much about stringing together combos. So it actually had a very different rhythm, even though they superficially looked very similar, since they both came out in the same year. There was actually very different stuff going on under the hood, and it allowed Fatal Fury to kind of stand out as its own thing, separate from Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat, particularly in Japan. Once they had Fatal Fury, and Fatal Fury took off, they started going all in on fighting games. I mean, they did some other games as well, but a lot of the biggest hits on the Neo Geo system, in the arcade and in the home, were the fighting games. The Fatal Fury series, the Art of Fighting series, the King of Fighters series. Of course, multiple sequels in all of these series started to be their real bread and butter. This, I think, is what gave the Neo Geo its staying power, such that it had. I mean, it was never, obviously, super big. I mean, the arcade hardware was a smash hit. But whatever clout the coin-op hardware had, I think, was because of the fighting games. Because the other thing that was very interesting about these is that these games actually used a memory card system. So you could actually save your progress in these games at home or in the arcade, and then take that save data and use it at the other place. It kind of had this way to link together home play and arcade play as well, which was very interesting.
That'd be interesting to see, how to have a card that has your save data. How did that work from an economic standpoint? Because at home I can see the save state, what the card works. I want to transfer it around, back it up, whatever. But if I take that into an arcade, then I got to put in quarters in order to access it. What would be the practical upshot there?
You can start right where you left off. I mean, this isn't for the fighting games. In one of their side-scrolling action games, you could start in the arcade right where you left off at home, thus saving yourself some quarters.
I guess if you need to practice up and get up to the point, but then I was like, why would I even go to the arcade and spend the quarters if I can play it at home?
I agree, and I don't know how popular it really was to use the memory cards. My guess is probably not terribly so, but it's just another interesting thing that they did, was having these separate memory cards.
The only way I can see it being beneficial is to be like, hey, I get street cred for putting my initials in this if I get near the end, and then go in there, put in one quarter, and I beat the game, and then I put my letters in.
Yeah, I mean, But, with this fighting game thing, then it became really, I think, desirable for the hardcore players to be able to have a Neo Geo at home where they could practice on the game at home and then go play against players in the arcade on the exact same hardware. I think that is what gave it a bit of a lift, particularly in Japan. The other series that I haven't mentioned yet, which is the game that really broke the system through in the US. And in the US, it really had a tough go of it. Even in the arcade, it had some modest success, but not a huge amount of success. Fatal Fury was not as popular as Street Fighter or Mortal Kombat in the United States. The real breakthrough in the US came in 1993 with the release of another one of their fighting game series, Samurai Showdown. I took a lot of flack. I forget whether it was a live stream or an episode or something that we did years ago now at this point. I took a lot of flack for saying that the Soul Calibur series was the first series of fighting games featuring weapons that were incredibly popular. I took some flack for that because people were like, dude, Samurai Showdown, hello. Yes, mea culpa on that. Because Samurai Showdown was indeed the original, very popular weapon-based fighter in the arcades in the US. It actually became a really big, it was popular in Japan too, but it became really popular in the US upon its release in 1993. It's interesting. It was created by a guy by the name of Yasushi Adachi. It had started out as a beat-em-up game involving monsters as the heroes. You were these monstrous characters and, just kind of a standard beat-em-up. He was really fascinated by the character of Edward Scissorhands from the Tim Burton movie. So he liked this idea of a monster character that had blades for hands. He was kind of making this beat-em-up game that already involved weapons and all of this. Then, the fighting game boom kind of took off at the expense of the beat-em-up genre. So he changed direction and turned it into this fighting game in Shogunate Japan, but involving weapons. He did keep the one monster character in, though he got rid of most of the rest of the monster characters. It's mostly humans. Made it a weapon-based fighting game, and the thing that made this game stand out is that the weapons weren't just, it's the exact same thing as Street Fighter, except instead of punching each other, they're swinging swords at each other. Since he did have weapons in the game, he wanted the players to feel the danger of the weapons. In real life, obviously, give a guy a choice between getting punched in the face and getting hit with a sharp sword in the face. Which you gonna choose?
Probably one if I want to live and one if I want to die.
Exactly. The weapons in this game hit hard. A lot of the bouts are relatively fast bouts because those weapons do a lot of damage. Again, this created a kind of different flow to the game from Street Fighter or Mortal Kombat or even Fatal Fury. And the other thing that he put into it, which he gave an interview to the website Polygon, which is where most of this comes from. The other thing that Adachi put into it was this thing called the Ikari meter, which literally means the rage meter. He put this in because he would get frustrated playing Street Fighter 2, because as I said, Street Fighter 2 is very much a game of chaining together moves and combos, and so they were playing Street Fighter 2 for research, because of course they're going to be informed by the other fighting games on the market when they're making their own fighting game. He was getting beat really badly by his fellow players who were better than them, and they were just landing hit after hit after hit, and he just had no chance. He just got so mad at that he decided he would put a rage meter in the game, which basically is as you take damage, this Ikari meter, or rage meter as it's called in the US, would fill up. Then when it filled up, you could unleash a super powerful attack and thus turn the tables on the person that has generally had the upper hand on you. It had a few interesting twists, and for whatever reason, I guess probably because it was just a very different flavor of fighting game from Street Fighter 2 and Mortal Kombat, it really won over players in the US that were looking for something new. It was one of the most popular games of 1993 in the arcade, one of the most popular kit games, of course released for Neo Geo. I think that gave it a bit of a boost in the United States then at that point as well, though it was never that big. It's hard to find sales figures. I don't have great sales figures. I found one newspaper article from the beginning of 1993 that mentioned that Neo Geo had maybe about 5% of the US console market at the end of 1992, beginning of 1993. There is one French magazine, Console Plus, that listed some sales figures for various consoles in one of its issues. I don't know exactly what their source is, so these figures may not be completely accurate. This magazine says that the Neo Geo sold 410,000 units, of which 350,000 of those were sold in Japan, almost entirely sold in Japan. It didn't do great, but it didn't necessarily have to do great because they weren't primarily a home game company. They were primarily an arcade company. And in the arcades, the system did really, really well. And especially also, it did really well in street locations. I don't know about you, Jeffrey, but I remember in the mid-90s when video games had basically disappeared, arcade games had basically disappeared from street locations, non-arcade locations. I can remember that the one thing I would consistently see in a non-arcade location, if a place had a video game system, it was a Neo Geo system.
I don't recall anything. All my recollections of video game consoles being in anything is usually some arcade, either at the mall, the movie theater, or some sort of play area like that mini golf place we used to go to.
Yeah, Centerfield Park. But yeah, they weren't super common in our area, but every so often I would see a video game out in the wild, and it was invariably a Neo Geo system, because as the 90s went on and video game cabinets were getting bigger and more elaborate and having more custom controls, and the technology was getting more and more advanced with all these 3D games, street locations were really getting priced out or spaced out, because a lot of them just took up so much space, of coin-op, which is something that had been a staple of street locations like convenience stores and grocery stores and all of these kind of places in previous eras. But the Neo Geo system was something that was fairly compact, and you could stuff multiple games into. Those fighting games were still pretty popular in the mid-90s. The arcade hardware was very successful. SNK probably held on to it a little too long, because since they kept supporting the Neo Geo, which was not capable of polygonal graphics, they were kind of caught out when the market started shifting to polygonal graphics and more elaborate control schemes. They were kind of stuck doing Neo Geo. That probably put them at a disadvantage long term. It was a successful system, and even in later years, because they kept doing all of their fighting game series, Fatal Fury, Samurai Showdown, Art of Fighting, King of Fighters. Then they had another kind of minor hit in 1996 with the run-and-gun game Metal Slug that was known for its fun, cartoony graphics. They had some games that were fairly moderately successful in the arcade, and they had some penetration for that system, so the MVS was pretty successful in arcades. In the home, 410,000 worldwide, almost entirely in Japan, if those numbers can be believed. I'm sure that was fine for them, because I don't think they were trying to corner the market, but obviously, not a huge number of people had them. There was one final evolution of the system, because, of course, as we said, it was expensive, and they tried a few different things. They were able to lower the price of the cartridges after a time from $200 to $180. Woo. So much cheaper.
Yeah, come back to me when you say that's $100.
At some point, they did divide into a Neo Geo Gold edition and a Neo Geo Silver edition. The Silver edition came with only one controller and I think no game bundled in, and therefore was a lot cheaper. A lot cheaper means it was like $400 instead of $650. Not much of a difference. With the Gold Edition, they added a second pack-in game without raising the price, so they were trying various ways to get it cost reduced over time, but they really couldn't, because it was a commercial-level system. It wasn't a home-quality system, so there was no real way to get that down to a realistic price in the home. They did do one final innovation of it, and that is they tried to go to CD-ROM in order to drastically reduce the price. So in 1994, they did release a system called the Neo Geo CD. It took CDs instead of the cartridges. They also went to a more standard type of gamepad instead of a full arcade stick controller. This allowed them to get the price down a little bit. They were able to sell that for $400 instead of $650, and more importantly, they could sell the games for somewhere between $50 and $80 instead of $180 to $250, which was kind of the range of the originals. They re-released most of the original Neo Geo games, going all the way back to the original ones from 1990. They re-released most of them on CD-ROM, and of course released new games going forward on CD-ROM. Didn't come out in the US until like 1996, but came out in Japan in 1994. The Neo Geo CD was really too little too late. Maybe if they had gone that route back when they had launched in 1990, or even if they had done it a couple of years later in 1992, maybe that would have been interesting. But by 1994, the PlayStation is coming out in Japan, which is a CD-based system that is way cheaper and, does polygonal graphics. The CD-ROM drive was only a one-speed CD-ROM drive.
That is very slow, kids.
Yes.
As anyone who's grew up in the 90s, or had to deal with CD-ROMs in the 90s, 1X was bad. 4X was sad, but okay. 8X was pretty good.
Yes.
16X was great. 32X was fantastic.
But not that 32X.
But not the other 32X, yes.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, super slow. And when they were releasing in North America, they were going to release it with a double-speed CD-ROM drive. Speculation is that they had problems implementing this because they were going to release the system in fall of 1995. They missed that deadline, released it in January 1996 instead, and scrapped the idea of using a double-speed CD-ROM. So speculation is that they tried to do this thing and failed miserably. So yeah, it was just too little too late at that point. The technology was just too aging, and while switching to CD did bring down the cost some, which was the goal, it didn't bring down the cost enough to compete with the new wave of systems that were coming. Now, that said, it did have a somewhat enthusiastic response in Japan. It sold about 570,000 units worldwide. Again, if this French magazine can be believed, of which 450,000 of those were sold in Japan. The rest of them sold in the rest of the world. It outsold the original because some of those Neo Geo fighting games, I think, were still pretty popular, and so that propelled some sales. But obviously, even its failed competition, like the Sega Saturn's considered a failure, a horrible failure. It sold 9 million units worldwide, before it was discontinued. I mean, 500,000 units.
And barely that.
Yeah, and barely that is really nothing to write home about. But considering how expensive it was, you could argue on the flip side that it's incredible it sold that much. And it definitely seems like it sold more than they were originally expecting, because particularly in the US as well, even though it didn't sell huge amounts in the US, because I have one article where their marketing person is talking about how, we originally targeted like 25 to 36-year-olds, but now we're targeting all the way down to 18-year-olds because we've discovered that there's demand amongst younger people for the system too. So, I mean, I don't think you would categorize the Neo Geo systems as a failure, just because they were always going to be incredibly niche, and SNK knew they were always going to be incredibly niche. They didn't have like these delusions of grandeur. After the Neo Geo CD, they continued to market consoles until 1997, which is when they got out of the console business, and that was kind of the end. And they continued to support it even after that. They continued to sporadically make games for it all the way into the early 2000s, because, of course, they still had the arcade hardware out there, so they might as well. It's a footnote in video game history, but it's kind of an interesting footnote. The one time that somebody tried to bring the power of the arcade into the home on a one-for-one basis. Maybe not particularly successful, but probably also not a gigantic failure either, though. Like I said, even in the arcade, where I think it's fair to say that it was a big success, they probably locked themselves into it a little too much and kind of missed the polygonal or 3D revolution as a result, which left them in much weaker financial footing and ended with the company being bought out at the beginning of the 2000s.
I wonder how much this thing costs these days. If it cost $650 back in the time, $200 a game. What's it on eBay? Still pretty expensive. So I'm definitely not buying that for my home.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a collector's item now, right? And, of course, there were limited quantities of it, and the fewer of something that there was back in the day means it's very scarce today, which drives up the cost, because it's an interesting moment in video game history and, an interesting little system. It's just a hard sell at $650 a pop.
So I guess there's nothing more we can say about a Neo Geo. It has shook our world in a new way, but only briefly. What shall we investigate in our next episode?
Well, I think we should investigate something that shook the world a little more permanently. Of course, at the time of this recording, the latest expansion to Final Fantasy XIV has just launched. I'm definitely very much in a Final Fantasy state of mind, and even earlier this year, of course, the second part of the Final Fantasy VII Remake series launched as well. Final Fantasy VII is a kind of important game that we haven't gone into depth on yet, and there's a lot of great information on it out there. I think we should keep this 90s wave going. We spent so much time in the 70s, which I find interesting, but nobody cares about. Sniff, sniff. So I think we keep this 90s thing going with a little Final Fantasy VII.
Final Fantasy VII, as opposed to the Final Fantasy's tale. Or do we continue Final Fantasy's tale as Final Fantasy VII?
Well, we're not going to talk about the intervening games, so...
Oh, they're not important. 2, 3, 4 with some sort of airships, Black Knights, 5 with crystals, 6 with some sort of mad deranged clown. We just have 7 with girls being stabbed in the back for our entertainment.
Something like that.
Final Fantasy VII, polygonal graphics, the PlayStation, and all the horrors of losing your memory because you drank way too much Mako. Next time on They Create Worlds. Check out our show notes at podcast.theycreateworlds.com, where we have linked to some of the things we discuss in this and other episodes. You can check out Alex's video game history blog at videogamehistorian.wordpress.com. Alex's book, They Create Worlds, the story of the people and companies that shaped the video game industry, Volume 1, can now be ordered through CRC Press and at major online retailers. Email us at feedback@theycreateworlds.com. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/theycreateworlds. You can also help by leaving a review on your favorite podcasting service. We also now have the podcast available on YouTube. Intro music is Airplane Mode by Josh Woodward, found at joshwoodward.com/song/airplane mode, used under a Creative Commons Attribution License. Outro music is Bacterial Love by Roll Up Music, found at freemusicarchive.org, used under a Creative Commons Attribution License.